Good morning, everybody, and thanks so much to Eero and the Estonian Refugee Council for inviting me. I'm really delighted to be here, especially because this is a conference focused on big ideas, new ideas, and innovation. And I'm sorry, Eero, I'm not sure I'm going to be much more optimistic than you were in your remarks about where we are today, but I'm hoping that I can end on a note of optimism and hope. So, the title of this session is Has Humanitarianism Reached Its Limits? It was inspired by a discussion I attended in New York in September in the margins of the UN General Assembly. And this discussion was about the conflict in Gaza and the food insecurity in Sudan. What we're seeing in Gaza is dehumanizing slaughter and destruction. And in the meantime, flouted by the governments who are not paying attention to international law. We're seeing the worst levels of food insecurity in Sudan. And at the same time, we're seeing in places like Bangladesh and in Nepal, the worst floods in decades, at a time when the governments and the aid agencies are unable to keep up, yet these are predictable disasters. So it leaves me thinking, has humanitarianism as a concept and a practice reached its limits? Or is this a crisis of our own making? Have we just found ourselves getting into too much, under-skilled, under-resourced, and used as political cover for inaction? And what should we be doing about this? So, my name is Christina Bennett. I'm the CEO of the START Network. And while we're maybe not going to be able to answer all of these questions here definitively today, they're pretty existential. So I'd like to have this conversation with you, and I'm delighted to have it. But maybe just first a little bit about START Network so you know where I'm coming from with this discussion. So we're a membership of soon to be 140 local, national, and international NGOs working across 6 continents and operating through 10 locally led hubs. And the diversity by our membership is by design. We believe that by bringing different types of organizations together, we represent the best of what the humanitarian aid system has to offer to tackle the complexities of what we're facing today. But while we are diverse, we're bound by a common frustration about the way that aid is delivered and resourced and approached. We are united by a desire for system-level change. We believe the humanitarian system needs a rethink. Currently, it is too centralized, too reactive, too fixed in its ways. We have to be more locally led. We have to be more anticipatory. We have to be more modern, more flexible, and more anti-colonial in the way that we work. And at START Network, we try to demonstrate this new way of working through practical action. We try to model the change that we want to see, to learn from it, and then to export that learning and bring that learning to all of you who can use it to change the system and to take those changes to scale. But getting back to the topic of our discussion today, I'm going to put a few numbers on some of the trends that you've already heard our speakers talk about. In 2024, the headlines about our sector are in fact sobering, but they are also all too familiar. Risks, vulnerabilities, needs are increasing. More than 400 million people around the world need humanitarian assistance due to conflicts and climate emergencies. And most of the people that make up that need are living in contexts that have been in an emergency for more than 5 years. This represents a really significant shift over the last decade. In 2014, only 29% of humanitarian funding went to long-term crises, but in 2024, this has reached 91%. At the same time, as you've heard from others, funding for the humanitarian sector has stalled. Donors have cut off their humanitarian contributions or drastically reduced them. And private funding, which was so available during the outbreak of war in Ukraine, has been scaled back. There are also signs that funding for international humanitarian assistance will further reduce in 2024. As of today, almost at the end of 2024, it's only 25 million has been committed to humanitarian funding of the billion required. And as others have also said, the gaps between needs and available resources are wide, with predictions of 2024 possibly having one of the widest gaps on record. A small number of donors provide the vast majority of the funding. This makes the entire sector vulnerable to political and economic changes in those few countries, underlying the fragility of a system that is already under strain. And we'll talk about the US elections in just a moment. And they're channeled to too few large institutions, mainly UN agencies, international NGOs, and mainly for humanitarian response, that is, post-event. This oligopoly of funding recipients goes against some of our primary reform targets. Didn't we commit to targeting, to channeling 25% of our funding to local organizations in the Grand Bargain several years ago? We've only provided those local organizations with 4.4% of that funding. And isn't one of our other reform agendas anticipatory action and risk-based finance? But in 2023, we only provided 1% of funding in advance of crises, and this despite knowing that 55% of emergencies are in fact predictable, and this despite knowing that we have the evidence, the technology, that to demonstrate that acting ahead of a crisis is more effective, more impactful, and more ethical. In the meantime, what is all this funding for? 2023 turned out to be one of the most violent years since the end of the Cold War, with 59 conflicts in Ukraine, Ethiopia, Sudan, and Israel and Gaza, causing spikes in civilian deaths. In 2023 alone, civilian deaths from October to the end of the year in the occupied Palestinian territory was equivalent to almost 60% of the total number of civilians killed the year before, which itself was the deadliest year on crisis, the deadliest year since the Rwandan genocide of 1994. Almost one child in every 5 is living in or fleeing from conflict. But interestingly, it is climate change that is the biggest driver of humanitarian crises. Climate change mitigation and adaptation efforts have not been sufficient to reduce the increase in the disasters that result from natural hazards. Scientists now agree we are in an era of loss and damage. And loss and damage is the very thing that humanity deal with. So now we're being asked to step in. Loss and damage will be 10 times the size of the current global humanitarian budget by 2030 and 50 times the size of the global humanitarian budget by 2050. And almost all of those destructive events are small to medium scale. So not the stuff that you're ever going to hear in headlines, but cumulatively making up the most of human suffering. These statistics will be familiar to many of you. Forced displacement is at an all-time high, with 117 million people displaced in 2023, expected to exceed 126 million in 2024. And here it is the effects of climate and conflict that come together to impact all aspects of productive life: food, water, energy, health, jobs, spreading to new latitudes and new regions, and compromising vulnerability in people's lives. Meanwhile, what do we have going on in the world? The external environment is unforgiving, relentless. More than 4 billion people will have voted in 50 or so elections by the end of 2024, and the outcomes of those elections will have significant impact on our work. Just take the UK and the US elections alone. These are 2 core donors to humanitarian funding. In the UK, the new Labour government did not reverse the aid cuts of their Conservative predecessors. In fact, they've announced even deeper aid cuts, and aid cuts that we expect will last for another decade. And getting to the US elections results that happened yesterday, and I am an American, those election results will be a shock, not only to me personally, but also to our system. As you saw, the US is by far the largest humanitarian donor, and the new Trump presidency is expected to slash foreign aid spending, reverse and eliminate many of the US's climate commitments, and will change the way that US aid is funded and delivers its work. However, interestingly, on that last point, Trump may be a strange ally for localization. Trump's foreign policy playbook, you may have heard of Project 2025 that was drafted by the Heritage Foundation, mentioned shifting US aid funding away from expensive and inefficient UN agencies and large US NGOs and toward local organizations to avoid duplication, to build on local initiatives, and to make much more efficient use of US taxpayer dollars. Trump is also expected to rationalize the US bureaucracy around aid, bringing humanitarian and development departments under one empowered political appointee. So we've all been talking about this nexus, I don't know for how many years, ever since I was in this sector. Will bringing these together under one roof help to bring coherence to our humanitarian and development agendas, or will it just further politicize them? Yet to be known. Elsewhere in Europe, elections have taken place in the Netherlands, Sweden, Denmark, and they've shifted politics to the right. That has meant more aid restrictions. Elections in South Asia have limited the entry of foreign funds into those countries, drastically cutting funding to many small organizations and causing them to close. On climate, not all the news has been dire this year in terms of elections. In Indonesia, renewables and climate was on the election ballot for the first time in its history, and renewables something that most candidates proposed. In South Africa, critics inside and outside the governing party blamed the government's deep links to the coal industry for its power problems while touting renewables as a solution. And in Mexico, the governing party chose a climate scientist, Claudia Sheinbaum, to succeed their oil-friendly incumbent as president. So, back to our sector, what we're seeing in our sector too is the questioning of the legitimacy of our major institutions like the UN and the World Bank. When I was at the UN General Assembly this year, there was this Summit for the Future, which was Antonio Guterres' sort of last attempt at reforming the UN system. He promised deep reforms within the Security Council to right the existing power imbalances that have existed there since the end of the Second World War. And at the end, they did sign this Pact for the Future. But while the Pact for the Future gave Africa 2 permanent seats on the Security Council, which is great news, it did not go as far as to give them the all-powerful veto. So in fact, the power has not really been shifted. And meanwhile, the voices inside and outside the UN for that reform continues to grow. And the questioning of the legitimacy of these institutions and the decrease in funding for all of our work has resulted in the instability of our own organizations. So last summer, the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, and the International Rescue Committee, 2 very established, very large international aid organizations, announced significant layoffs to their global staff and rolled back dozens of its operations across the world. A real wake-up call to international institutions that they may need to rethink their remit and they may need to rethink their footprint. And we are, as a sector, struggling with foundational dilemmas that are questioning our purpose, our practice, and our positioning. Now, as long as I've been in this sector, we've always been that sort of questioning group of people, always wringing our hands over what we're about and why we're doing what we're doing. But it seems like we're questioning ourselves even more. We're questioning our principles. For example, are they still relevant when no one is interested in adhering to them? Conflicts in the Middle East and Ukraine are throwing up a lot of discussion, for example, around the principle of neutrality. And you're going to hear more about this in the panel on ethics. But, you know, in the Middle East, there are different disagreements within humanitarian leadership of organizations saying, how can we be neutral when the parties to the conflict are not abiding by IHL? We, as Start Network, have a local member in Ukraine, and this Ukrainian member said to me, Christina, how can we agree to be neutral when our country has been invaded? We will never be mutual. We will always be on the side of Ukraine. We're also questioning our purpose, whether our narrow definition of what humanitarianism is still relevant. As we saw from the statistics I just showed you, crises are almost never short-term. Community needs go beyond mere survival. And loss and damage from climate hazards is going to take up our bandwidth for some time. Should we be, in fact, looking to include building community resilience and well-being into our humanitarian work? Should we be looking for a new form of humanitarian resistance that is based much more on delivering fundamental human rights and principles like solidarity? Or should we, as Oxford academic Hugo Slim recently wrote about, shift our focus from one entirely seized of human beings to a whole of landscape approach where we look after humans, but we look after the earth as well? And we're questioning who is a humanitarian. And that brings me to sort of this point that will be taken up in the AI discussion later. We've got insurance companies, tech companies, local human rights organizations, environmentalists, all active in crisis settings, determining who is at risk, who needs assistance, and how. I hope that we'll hear about some positive use cases of AI later on, but what I've seen is the world's major militaries are scaling up their use of AI, and yet we don't know as a sector what to do with that. In one of its pitch videos, Palantir, which is a software company and major US military contractor, uses a chatbot to order drone reconnaissance, generate plans of attack, and organize the jamming of communications. But the extent to which that system complies with international humanitarian law is yet undefined and unregulated. In that example, who is responsible for violations of international humanitarian law? The military, the software company, the chatbot? And who should we hold to account? So, in summary, in 2024, what are we seeing? We are seeing escalating, protracted humanitarian needs framed by relentless, catastrophic climate hazards and more violence since the end of the Cold War. We're seeing flatlined funding and a widening gap between needs and resources, and calls for humanitarians to ever do more with less. Amidst all of this, reform fatigue that sees aid organizations dragging their feet on these transformational shifts that we know we need to be making. While the fundamental shifts around us across our geopolitics, our climate, our technology, and our capability are firmly underway, and we're not keeping up. So, back to my original question. Has humanitarianism as a concept and a practice reached its limits in a changing world that demands more from international aid and probably should? What should we be doing about it? So, to conclude, a bit of a thought experiment for all of you. How might we redefine what humanitarian is and does? Should we adopt, for example, a back-to-basics approach that is narrow in scope, entirely focused on short-term emergency response based firmly on humanitarian principles, humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence? Here we play our traditional core role, focused on our impact and aligning our activities with our limited funds. Or should we instead adopt a whole-of-crisis approach that roots all of our work firmly in what communities needs and want, irrespective of whether those needs are humanitarian or development or peace or fixing a streetlight or fixing a road, and potentially refocuses our work not only on those communities, but on the climate and ecological needs that exist around them? Or should we be adopting a social solidarity approach that goes beyond the notions of aid and charity, making direct investments in communities, advancing their economic opportunity, their skills, their development and entrepreneurship, acting as conduits to crowd in outside sources of funding, and private investment to enable technology, knitting together social enterprises and channeling resources to communities instead of extracting resources from them while we are working there. So none of these solutions that I've put up here, or I'm saying to you, are the answer, really. But they are all possible. And I suspect the answer lies somewhere in between them or somewhere taking the best from each. But as we go through the day today, I urge you to think about these questions. Think about the trends you've just seen, and have these discussions about what are the new ethics we need to have, what are the new forms of financing, and how do we deal with the possibility, but also the challenge of artificial intelligence. And to borrow from a poem that I read after the US election a couple of days ago, I urge you not only to find optimism, I urge you to find optimism not because the news is necessarily good, but because there are good people demonstrating that change is always possible. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the day, and I hope that we can have a bit of a discussion if there's time left. Thanks.
If there are any questions, please raise your hand and I can give you the microphone to make sure the people who are listening to us afterwards can also hear the questions.
I think I'll just take one here, and then please raise your hand, and then I'll take a couple at a time. Please, go ahead. And let me know where you're from, too.
Hi, my name is... Can you guys hear me? Yeah. My name is Andres. I am half Mexican, half American. I'm just really interested what your outlook is for Mexico specifically. You mentioned Shane Baum as a climate scientist, but I mean, she does not repudiate any of the policies of AMLO, which were very not pro, like especially on the climate side of things. I just wonder what your professional kind of outlook for her administration is and how kind of international aid will look like under her administration. Yeah.
So I'm not an expert on Mexican politics, so I can't really tell you what my outlook would be for Mexico. But what I would say is, while I might have been more optimistic a few months ago about the possibility of maybe pressure from her neighbors to be able to adopt really progressive climate policies, I doubt that she's going to get that now. And with the close alliances between the United States and Mexico, I'm not sure that we're going to see real change, real impetus behind climate commitments between the Paris Agreement by sort of North America, or at least North America, Mexico, and the United States in the coming years. But having said that, you know, what we saw in the United States under the previous Trump administration, and possibly what we can see in a context like Mexico, is not relying on national governments to make those changes, but relying on cities, relying on sort of the subnational administration, governors, mayors, directorates, to work toward progressive climate policies and practices within their own kind of smaller context, so that it's sort of people, not necessarily governments or institutions, that make the changes that potentially our leaders are not going to make.
Thank you.
Hello, good morning. Thank you very much for your talk. I'm Kirsi Korhonen from Startup Refugees in Finland. You come from a big country with a lot of organizations. We come from a smaller one, Estonia, also quite small. We have our Latvian colleagues here as well, and possibly other smaller countries. So sometimes we are quite overwhelmed by all these situations that are happening, and the election. Even though we are far away from the US, it's still demoralizing in a way. So what can we do in our smaller circles here to have these thought experiments, or indeed have that faith that the poem that you read still sort of tries to bring forward? So maybe still some more words of encouragement and out of the box thinking. Thank you.
I'm still trying to get my head around this myself, but I guess I'm an optimist by character, so I'm trying to think of what we can do versus what is going to get in our way. And, you know, so the START Fund, which is this fund that we run at START Network, has 16 different donors. And in fact, we just started receiving US funding, so the largest humanitarian donor has not been a funder of the START Fund for the last 10 years. Instead, that fund is funded by many, many small donors and organizations that participate in the fund to really make it the fastest humanitarian fund out there. So I don't think you need to be big to be impactful. You can be small but mighty, speak with a loud voice. And I think also what we need to do is, you know, America, the UK, the United States, these big, you know, Germany, these big governments have lots of very, very well established, well-meaning civil servants working within them, and an apparatus that will ensure that none of the more drastic of these policies will come through. So work within the communities that you have, the networks that you have. Raise your voice from the bottom. Always make sure that you are sharing your ideas, you're exporting your learning, that you work with the networks that you have to continue to move forward. I just think that change in our sector is not going to come by revolution. It's going to come by evolution. It's going to come by incremental change. So as long as you are working to make those small changes, I believe change can happen. So just continue to work, to network, and to make your learning and your voice heard wherever you can. But I might have better things to say about that in a few weeks once I've digested all of this.
Thank you.
I think we did have one last question.
Yes, hello. My name is Thomas Burns. I'm an independent consultant, been in the humanitarian industry for many years, from Ireland, despite my accent. And the question I was going to ask is, you talk about opportunities and an incredible presentation there, but the fundamentals of aid flows from big donors to UN agencies to INGOs down to national NGOs maybe is institutionalized and is becoming more pronounced as donors have less resources to manage grants and manage things. How do you see that shift changing? You know, how do these trends we're already seeing are actually driving more funding to the UN agencies and less towards the field? So, and what's the mechanism that you imagine for this transformative change that could be happening there? Sorry, big question.
Thank you. So I would see that the changes need to come both in the sources and uses of funds. On the sources of funds, we cannot be relying on these big institutions. I mean, the institutional donors are always going to be providing the bulk of the funding because they can provide tens of millions. So they'll always be sort of providing the bulk of funding for humanitarian assistance. But let them do the work of providing the funding for things like conflicts, which other potential donors, private companies, will never do. It's too risky for them. So reserve ODA for conflict settings. Meanwhile, there's a lot of other things going on that we can use additional funding for. So, you know, whether it's climate or new technologies or new ways of working or, in fact, community resilience, there are plenty of private organizations, philanthropists, you know, corporates that are interested, insurance companies, for example, that are interested in getting involved in this, both because they have commitments to it sort of in their organizations and by decree, but also because they want to do their part in making the world sort of a better place. So let's crowd in different types of donors that do not necessarily have the compliance requirements that the big donors have, but won't necessarily fund through the UN and other big institutions. So there is a way to break up sort of that oligopoly that exists between existing funders and existing institutions by just crowding in more and different. But I also think we have to change the way, sort of change the model by way we receive that funds. So this is going to sound a little self-serving, but you know, we're a network, and we're a network that serves as an intermediary between the big donors and their funding, or the philanthropists and their funding, and local organizations on the ground. We are a pass-through. So when a donor says to us, well, we can't possibly fund hundreds of local organizations, we don't have the resources, we say, fine, fund us, and in a very light touch way, we're going to pass that money directly to local organizations without any pain from you. We will take on the risk, we will take on the compliance that you require, and we'll pass that along. So there are other business models, and I would suggest for international NGOs, it is a good business model to act as that intermediary so that funding can flow to more organizations. We can demonstrate that working through local organizations is more impactful, efficient, but also ethical. So I think there are different business models we can look at to break all of that up. Thanks.
I think we are running out of time, but definitely take a moment to find Christina afterwards to ask if you have any additional questions.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks for listening, and I hope to be able to have many conversations with you throughout the day. Take care.